Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And in this one, I'm covering my round 7 game from the Open Portugal 2019 event that happened in February. My opponent here was Vitaliy Bernadskiy, a Ukrainian GM that is fairly young and has played in the Ukrainian Championship a few times, so he's definitely one of the better players out there. And thus far in the tournament, I actually was doing very well. I had 5 out of 6 going into this one, and you don't normally think about this until towards the end of the tournament, but it does start to creep in that, hey, I'm doing pretty well. If I keep the trend here, I might be able to get a Grandmaster norm or a GM norm. And for those that don't know, to become a Grandmaster, you need to have 3 GM norms in addition to a rating of 2,500 at some point in your career. And I had 1 GM norm at this time, so I was vying for GM norms. So having the white pieces in particular really did give me the thought process like, hey, this might be a really good shot to sort of make that push towards the GM norm. So I was going this game trying to win. I go in every game pretty much trying to win, but especially with the white pieces, you think this is your opportunity to kind of seize the advantage, take the bull by the horns, whatever analogy you want to use, that's what it's like. So anyways, I opened with d4. Vitaliy played knight f6, knight f3, g6, and here with g6, I'm already being told that I'm going to get a King's Indian defense or a Grunfeld defense. So it's a question of figuring out which one is it. Now, when I was looking at his games, it seemed that he played a lot of, when he did try to play dynamic openings, he was playing on the dark squares. So I actually guessed King's Indian. So I went c4, bishop g7. Again, I still don't know whether it's a Grunfeld or a King's Indian because that is determined by where black puts the d pawn on either d6 or d5. But after knight d3, castles, that finally told me it can be a King's Indian because I can go e4 and stop d5 from happening forever. And so black played d6, and here we are. We are in our King's Indian. So I guessed correctly. That's always good news. When you do your preparation, you guess correctly. That's excellent because it means you can kind of narrow in on what you're trying to focus on. Now, the night before, I also was looking at Grunfeld, and there are so many different lines to look at. But I also had to wrestle with the King's Indian. I thought, which variation should I choose? There's so many different variations. You can go for bishop e2 and castles. I'll actually show that I played bishop e2 here, and then black played e5. And here's actually really where the decision starts because you could castle and go for these lines. If you castle, you actually are inviting e takes d4, which is a potential sideline of the King's Indian, and you kind of have to defend this like Maroczy bind type of setup. That's one way. But some people are uncomfortable playing f3 and weakening this diagonal. Another way to play is to play the exchange variation. So you can go d takes e5, trade the queens, stick a knight on d5, and play for some slight edge. Although black has shown that they're more or less okay in these variations, you can at least play for some positional edge here. So that's another way of playing the exchange. Another consideration is just playing bishop e3. That's, I think, the Gligorich-Taimanov system, if I'm not mistaken. The idea with this system is that if they go knight c6 now and you go d5, you kind of get the ideal setup in the King's Indian for white, which is having the bishop on e3, the bishop on e2, and the knight on d2. These pieces are really well placed because they help facilitate the c5 break quite easily. And then the knight can actually go to c4 one day. Additionally, when you have the bishops like this together, when black gets off f5 and f4, the point is that white could play f3 and the bishop could drop back to f2. And when the white bishop is on the g1, a7 diagonal, normally you're able to better cope with the kingside attack that black is trying to pull off in the closed position. So that's another way you could play it. There's also the fianchetto variation. I mean, I played bishop e2 already, but there are lines where, black decides to play g3, bishop g2, keep the pawn on e2, and then try to exert influence on this diagonal with the light squared bishop. So there's so many different ways you could play the King's Indian with white. I'm definitely even leaving several variations out, but just giving you a brief survey. I decided to go after e5 with d5. The reason I decided to go with this variation, known as the Petrosian variation, is because I liked that my center in the middle is kind of a nice space advantage, and it's unassailable for the moment. Whereas when you play with castle, you actually are allowing e takes d4, and they're just these sidelines that you have to know quite a bit about, and I didn't want to challenge on that terrain. With d5, you know you have your space advantage, and it's just a matter of maintaining it, taking different advantages on other sides of the board, and just being able to play the closed position. I think the other nice thing about it is that closed position. Some King's Indian lines are open, some of them are closed, but I like the maneuvering of the closed position. Additionally, and I think this is probably important to note as well, there are less lines if you play the Petrosian. So what I mean by that is, in this position, right after d5, black has less setups. They pretty much have to first anticipate or deal with the c5 break that might happen very quickly. And normally they try to do that with a5 or knight b7. And then only when they've sort of have done that can they rattle off this, try and play for the f5 break. So that's the other thing, is it actually does limit some of black's options. So anyways, after d5, black played knight bd7. Not as popular as the move a5, but a very popular move. I think the second choice. The reason a5 is played, just to give you a glimpse of that, is you're stopping this b4 move from happening, and you're pretty much establishing the c5 square as a potential anchor for your knight. So that's the idea where you play a5, is you establish that as a thing. Knight bd7 is also playable, though. So after knight b7, I went bishop e3, and the point of bishop e3 is actually to kind of get this ideal King's Indian setup I mentioned, which is having the bishop on e3, this bishop on e2, and then the knight on d2. So let's say knight c5 is played. This was not played, but let's say it is. Now I'm going to protect the e4 pawn with knight d2. And the beauty of this setup is there's no knight g4 to harass my bishop because I have two pieces on this line. And additionally, if black plays for this f5 move, I'll be able to play f3 and bishop f2 and tuck that bishop back. And I'm just kind of in a comfortable position. Additionally, with this setup, I can prepare a3 and b4. And because my queen is protecting the rook, a5 would kind of, it's not something that would prevent b4 entirely. It would just slow it down a little bit. So that's really the benefit of it. And note that there are many lines where, let's say like a5, a3, where they try to play a4 to stop you from getting off b4. Because note, if you play b4, there's en passant. But in these positions with the bishop on e3, you can actually take that knight on c5 and then take on a4 if you wish, and actually just win a pawn. So because of those factors, that's like the dream scenario, dream setup in the Petrosian variation. Now, bishop e3 is provocative because it's black to move. So now black is actually able to challenge that bishop with knight g4. And it's pretty much the logical move. You don't want to allow the bishop e3, knight d2 maneuver. So now the bishop has to move. You do not want to give up this bishop and have these pretty ugly double pawns. If you give up those double pawns, let's say you make a move like castles, for instance, this position is really undesirable. And now this bishop on g7 can come to a nice new diagonal with bishop h6. And black is already better here. So you don't give up that bishop, and you play what I played bishop g5. And the point is that now this knight is potentially misplaced, potentially. And now I'm challenging the queen. So f6 was played to hit my bishop. Note that a move like queen e8 is not really in the cards now because I have knight b5. And the point is the c7, oops, so bad with arrows. The c7 pawn can't be dealt with right now because my bishop's controlling the line. So I'm just going to win in exchange because I'm also threatening after knight takes c7 to actually trap the queen. So, I'm going to get this fork in because you can't go rook b8 because now the queen's actually trapped, funnily enough. So f6 is pretty logical to deal with that. And now my bishop has to make another decision. It can go back to h4, it can go to d2, it can go to c1. I went bishop c1. And the argument here is that this knight on g4 is potentially misplaced. Now, you did hassle my bishop away, but the question is, and you hassled it back to the original square, but the question is at what cost? Is the cost of knight on g4 and pawn on f6 actually worth it? Is the knight going to h6 worth it? Well, we'll find out. Black played knight h6, going back right away, and I decided to go h4. And the point with h4 was actually to just take stock of the fact that this knight is a little bit loose here, and I can maybe go h5 and rip open the position for my rook. So I had very, very aggressive intentions here. f5 was played, trying to get some counterplay on the king side. Since I'm not castled, black doesn't necessarily mind opening up the middle potentially and getting play in the center. And after f5, I went knight g5. A very common maneuver in King's Indians for white is to play knight g5 and knight e6 if allowed, if black plays this f5 move, because that e6 square is so chronically weak. So getting a knight on e6 is really very desirable. So after knight g5, knight f6 was played, which does guard that square with the bishop on c8. Now, there are certain scenarios where you actually play knight e6 anyway. The point being that if you play knight e6, takes, the point is that now, even though this pawn might not be there for very long, the knight on c3 actually gets this d5 square, which is a monster square. And from there, you might be threatening e7 and all types of other stuff. So I didn't rush with knight e6, but I did have that square under observation. And instead, I decided to play h5. Again, showing my very aggressive intentions to rip open the h file and get something going. And I felt pretty good here because my opponent was eating up bundles and bundles of time, and I was not using very much time at this point because I felt that the moves were correct. So h5, g takes h5 was played. I think it was black was kind of very wary of just allowing me to play h takes g6 and having this rook on the file. And if you don't notice now, it's pretty clear my king on e1 is not necessarily trying to castle. So h5, g takes h5. And now I actually went knight e6. Now that the pawn structure was ruined, I thought it was a good opportunity for me to put the knight here, because after this exchange, now I have two bishops lined up against black's weak kingside pawns, and I thought, I'd have good play here. Additionally, after the exchange, my immediate threat might be just to play bishop takes h6 and e takes f5 and have two really nice connected passed pawns. So black played f4 to shut that down, basically trying to shut my bishop down and to stop e takes f5, which is a threat. But white actually already has a really, really amazing position. I'm temporarily a pawn down, right? I have 7 pawns and black has all 8. And this e6 pawn looks a little bit weak. But again, that knight d5 idea is important. And the fact that I have the 2 bishops is very important. Lastly, this bishop on g7 is really hemmed in behind its own pawn on e5. So for the time being, black's pieces are not very well, minor pieces that is, aren't very well coordinated. So the best move in this position was a move I actually didn't make. And if you want to take a moment, I'll actually give you 5 seconds to pause the video here and figure out what was the move that is most to the point in this position. All right, I think I gave you a moment to pause the video and give yourself time to think about it. The best move in this position is actually knight d5. And the reason knight d5 is so strong is because you're just threatening e7. And there isn't really great ways to deal with that. Like, the common thing you might consider is, oh, what about a move like queen e8 to attack the pawn? Well, here I have knight takes c7, and therein lies the problem. In a lot of these positions, if black actually tries to secure the pawn with the queen, they're nasty knight moves. And so with e7 being a threat, it's really tough to deal with. Rook e8 is an idea, but I'm not convinced that would work. I'm trying to figure out what's the flaw in this idea right now. But it seems I'm just skeptical that this is a good move. But maybe further analysis will need to be done to examine why that's the case. But it feels like it's wrong. At the very least, I can play knight takes f6 and bishop takes h5 and secure a really nice advantage on the light squares. Even though I'd eventually be losing the e6 pawn. Perhaps even e7 is a move. I'm not sure, but that might be an option. And yeah, after e7, if queen d7, maybe I have bishop takes h5. Again, hitting this rook on e8 and just causing all types of problems. Note that if a move like knight takes h5 is played, queen takes h5 might be a real problem. Something like c6 and queen h6, again, underlies the tactics in the position that exist. So it's just a very, very difficult to deal with this knight. And so really the way you might say, oh, why don't we get rid of it? Well, after knight takes d5, c takes d5, you could see what I was talking about before, this e6 pawn being pretty much a menace to society. Now I have a protected passed pawn on that square. This structure is pretty unassailable. The bishop on g7 is totally cut out of the game, and this h5 pawn is very weak and probably will be picked off. And maybe one day I might even castle queenside, who knows? So white would have a huge advantage here. Now, I didn't play knight d5, unfortunately. I actually played queen b3, and queen b3 is really based off of a few misjudgments. And it's many lines in the King's Indian when you have this e6 pawn, and you might consider queen b3 because you're putting pressure on this diagonal, but it's just not very timely, and it allows black to consolidate. So it just isn't a very good choice. I was also thinking in some world that maybe I castle queenside, but I really need to be sure to make sure this e6 pawn stays alive, or I get something in return for it. Otherwise, I am 2 pawns down, and my compensation would be fraying a bit. So it is very important that I put the knight on d5, and I just didn't. So after queen b3, I was targeting the b7 pawn. My idea was that these light squares would become very weak, so I thought, oh, I should target this. And black played b6, which is a reasonable move. And now I should go knight d5 again. This is how important this knight d5 move is, but I didn't actually do it. After knight d5, you could see something like rook e8, e7, and queen d7, knight takes f6, bishop takes, c5, and now you can see actually the queen on b3 actually coming to work, hitting this king on g8. And some variation like this, white would still be in pretty decent shape. Having the 2 bishops, this would be pretty good compensation. The 9h6 is misplaced. I'm going to be ready to castle and swing my other rook to h1. And white is in decent shape. But again, you can see all the play in the position once I have the pawn on e6 is getting my knight to d5, and I did not get that done. Instead, I went for c5. The idea is to, again, take advantage of the queen on this diagonal, entertain e7, discovery check. These are ideas that are thematic in when you have a pawn e6, but again, the knight to d5 is critical. And after c5, black played king h8, fine, stepping off. And after c takes b6 and a takes b6, I realized what I had done, because now castling queenside is not as attractive because the rook is on the line, and this e6 pawn is kind of a weakness if I don't have the tactical stuff that I was having before, and it means my queen might be tethered to that pawn. So in just a span of a few moves, I pretty much have thrown away my advantage. Just goes to show you have to really make sure you're playing a very precise set of moves to sort of get the ball through and to through that needle or whatever the expression is. And I didn't do it. So after a takes b6, I went knight d5 now, but you can see it's like 4 moves too late. And the issue here is that after knight d5, black could just take. Before, I had the c pawn on c4 that was going to take on d5 and kind of lock up the position. Here, I don't have the same luxury, and either way I take is kind of uncomfortable. If I play queen takes d5, black can consider harassing me with rook a5 eventually, and this rook can get to a very, very active position on the 5th rank. Additionally, black can just go queen e7 and rook f6 or rook e8 and try to round up the e-pawn. The flip side is what I did, e takes d5, and in this variation, I do have protected past pawns, but now this bishop on g7 is totally unleashed. Man, I'm going to get better at arrows one day. But the bishop on g7 is totally unleashed, and this knight on h6 that was controlled by the e4 pawn has this wonderful square in f5. So really, I'm playing with fire. My king is not secure anymore, and it's just not a great choice. So black went queen g5, immediately aggressively attacking my king side because now I have to really worry about a lot of squares. And after queen g5, I went g3, which in hindsight is completely ill-advised. For the time being, the pawn is immune because the bishop is on the line. But again, the idea of opening up the side where my king is right now, particularly when I don't have counterplay on black's king, is just a bad idea. And after g3, black just played knight g4, and you can see the saints are marching in. There are tactical threats here coming, e4 is coming, this bishop might be playing. It just does not look pretty, and honestly, it's just the game totally flipped. I went g takes f4 because I'd recognized that knight takes f2 was a threat. Let's say if I play a3, just to give you an example, I was worried about knight takes f2, and if king takes f2, f takes g3 discovered check scared me, because if I go like king g2, there's even rook f2 check, and it just wasn't convinced this was holdable, but I don't know. Additionally, black does not even have to sack. Black could consider being a little bit patient about it and going e4 or something, because even here, bishop takes f4 does not do that much. I mean, this exchange sack is almost begging to be played, and maybe black has some counterplay here. So, again, it is a little bit unclear because maybe I can get rid of the knight, and maybe I do have counterplay on the h7 pawn, but it just looks super shaky. My king is very, very weak on e1. So these are the types of things I was worried about, and that's why I tried to resolve that tension. But after g takes f4 and e takes f4, now I unleash this bishop. f3 is a threat. Huge problems. I went bishop d2, trying to just develop a piece, maybe getting my bishop to c3 eventually. f3 is not possible just yet because the queen on g5 is still... the pawn f4 is still pinned to the queen on g5, but I thought that was in my future. And now black played a move I was very surprised by. Rook f5. It's a wonder I was so surprised by this move. I mean, it seems kind of clear that the d5 pawn is loose. I just didn't... I don't know. I just kind of overlooked it. And now if my pawn on d5 collapses, this one collapses and my whole position is just done. So I went bishop f3 to defend that pawn. And now Vitaliy played rook e5 check, and now my king is on the run. I went king f1 to guard the f2 pawn. Note if I go the other way to d1, there's knight takes f2. And now black played knight takes f2 anyway. And now I was like, oh man, am I getting checkmated here? What did I miss? What did I miss? Because you could see that black's pieces have so much energy and my king is just barren. So after I played rook takes h5 first to challenge the queen, because if I play king takes f2, queen g3 check is really problematic. And if I go king f1, maybe you should pause the video for a moment and find the move that that delivers the knockout blow. All right, I think I gave you a moment to pause the video. I'm not so sure if this was the absolute best move, but I can tell you I was worried about rook e3. Deadly worried about rook e3. Point being that, like, after bishop takes e3, f takes e3 is an option, and I was thinking maybe rook f8 check is a problem. It just scared the life out of me. Another thing is maybe even queen takes f3 check is a problem, although I am noticing now that bishop f2 is okay. Oh, no, it's not. Excuse me. There's queen takes h1. So, yeah, so after rook e3, bishop takes bishop takes e3, queen takes f3, and I'm just losing the house. I'm losing the house. Because if I play the king here to g1 to hold the rook, then f takes e3, and this rook can come to g8, and my king has no squares pretty much, and queen f2 is a threat. It's over. It's totally over. So because of that threat, I cannot even take the knight on f2, and that's why I went rook takes h5. And for the moment, it's amazing that this knight actually can't give me any checks, and my bishop is controlling some squares where I'm not losing on the spot. And h5 pawn is kind of an important pawn because it gets me closer to the king on h7. So I did manage to just make it a little bit murky. So queen g3 was played. That's logical. And I took on e5. And now knight h3 was played. Very interesting intermediate move. The point being that queen f2 mate is a threat. And so it's very hard to deal with this rook and to deal with that mate. Especially because the move you want to play to save that rook, rook e2, which prevents queen f2 mate, actually takes away the escape square from the king so that queen g1 is mate. So really pretty looking intermediate move. After knight h3, I have to go on the run because of this queen f2 threat. And first I started with bishop e1. The reason I start with bishop e1 is because if I start to run with king e2, now queen f2 check is a problem. And after king d1, now bishop takes e5. And I felt here that my king was not going to be able to shuttle itself to safety in time. So I started with bishop e1 because, again, my bishops right now are my saving grace, holding on very precariously to some of these squares on my king side. So queen g1 check, king e2, and now bishop takes e5. And I must say that the first wave of this attack is nearly over. The dust has settled a little bit. I'm a pawn down, but I still managed to keep my pawn structure in the center. So I have this really nice protected pass pawn on e6. And in addition, I have the two bishops now. And the bishop pair, well, I actually had it earlier, but now the position is a little bit more open. I was already thinking that if I trade queens in a position like this, my protected pass pawn will tell and I'll have a great position. Because the other issue is that Black's queenside pawns are a little bit weak, in particular the c7 pawn that's backward. And the c7 pawn is pretty much the thing that's holding the black pawn chain together on the queen side. So my goal here was, if I survive this attack, I might finally have some chance. So my bishop is pinned to the rook on a1. I need to solve some of these problems, so I went rook c1. Again, eyeing this weak c7 pawn, potentially activating my rook, and maybe one day my bishop gets out and my rook actually hits the queen. I do have to be a little bit wary about that because there's queen f2 check, but these were the ideas. So queen g7 retreating move went back, defending that c7 pawn. I was happy to see this move because it meant that the queen was not actually in my immediate periphery, so I was cool with that. The flip side is that now that the queen has left the g1 square, knight g1 check might be a threat. And that's a very, very nasty check, in addition to the b2 pawn actually hanging. So I went king d1 to move my king away from this knight g1 check, and really, again, to try and preserve the two bishops, which are have been my saving grace the past few moves while my king has danced around the board. Black went knight g5, hitting that bishop on f3. And now I went bishop at e2 again, trying to preserve these bishops at all costs. I thought that they were my saving grace. And now black played rook f8, trying to push the f-pawn home. Again, my king is still weak. These bishops, they can only do so much to shield my king, and now I have to worry about this f-pawn running, so really problematic. I went queen c2, trying to get my own counterplay going. The point being that I'm targeting the c7 pawn, and I am eyeing indirectly the f2 square. Note that a move like bishop takes b2 doesn't really faze me because I have queen takes c7, and the point is that bishop takes c1, I have bishop c3 winning the queen. So this is something I was aware of. Note that another thing that's kind of funny is if you go rook f6, trying to, not lose your queen, I actually have queen d8 check, which is a really awesome, funny-looking move that leads to mate. If queen f8, I just have queen takes f8 mate. So there is some hidden venom here with the two bishops. So after queen c2, black played f3. I think that's fine. I moved my bishop away to b5. And the thing I liked about this move is that it has two ideas. One, I'm, again, clearing the way for my queen and bishop to protect the f2 pawn. Secondarily, my bishop still keeps an eye on the f1 square, which is the critical queening square. And finally, it also eyes the e8 square. So if the queen ever leaves the 7th rank, I have potentially e7. Black played queen f6, actually leaving the c7 pawn, but threatening f2. And I thought, you know what, I probably shouldn't allow that. So I went bishop h4. The idea here was actually that if you play f2 in this position, I actually can go queen takes f2. And the point is after queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes, I have, again, this e7 move. And you can't stop that pawn from queening because the rook can't come back. And, my bishop is guarding the square as well. So, this would just win, actually. And now it's starting to get a little bit sharp because all of a sudden I have some trumps in the position, some tricks. My king is still on d1, very weak, but I managed to create some tricks. Black played rook g8, protecting that knight on g5, and also getting out of the way of e7 coming with tempo. But again, it doesn't necessarily threaten anything immediate because now I still have this pin. So now I have a chance. I wound up playing queen d3. Again, reinforcing my protection of the f1 square, clearing my rook to potentially take on c7. The computer actually suggests queen d2. Again, keeping more pressure on this g5 knight. And then strangely enough, it actually gives a repetition after bishop f4, queen c3, bishop a5, and queen d2. The point being is that you really can't allow this liquidation because I have e7 at the end. And additionally, black really can't trade queens because then my pawn would actually be more valuable than the f pawn. So if you play queen takes, I just play rook takes. e7 is a threat. I'm also eyeing this pawn. If I go bishop takes, rook f takes f3, that's an idea. And white would actually be winning. So I went queen d3, and that actually is not the best move, but I thought it created some chances for me. Black played queen f4, challenging this bishop on h4, good move. And I went rook c4 to attack this queen on f4 and protect my bishop. And you can just see it's a total mess. Black played queen h2, moving that queen away, still keeping an eye on the bishop, and now introducing ideas of queen h1 check or queen g1 and f2. And, very, very annoying move. And in this position, the best move actually turns out to be e7. Point being that after queen g1, I can go king c2, and after c6, an amazing move that blocks my bishop from protecting the e7 square and protecting the f1 square. There's a crazy line that goes d takes d6, knight e6, rook e4, rook g2, rook e2 block. Crazy line because now I'm threatening the queen. Knight d4 check, queen takes d4, queen takes e8 queen, and you just have this crazy line. King g7, rook takes g2, pawn takes, queen e7, and you have a repetition, strangely enough. But who's going to see all those moves, honestly? I mean, just one of those moves is incredible. Like, I mean, to see all of these moves, again, c6 is fair enough, distracting my bishop. But knight e6, rook e4, rook g2 blocking with the rook. No, that's not human stuff. Knight d4, sacking your queen. That is not human stuff. So, not surprising that I didn't see that stuff. I elected to go queen d2 and actually guard the first rank. The point is that if you play queen g1 now, I can go, not only does my queen eye the f2 square, now I can actually go king c2 and my queen is kind of shielded. And after queen g1 check, I went king c2. And I thought, you know what? It looks like my king is secure. I felt like I was somewhat out of the woods. And, hey, maybe e7 is a threat now. Now, in this position, it turns out that black is the one in the driver's seat with knight takes e6. The point is that you not only do you take this e6 pawn, you also threaten rook g2. So after d takes e6, rook g2, I'm losing my queen, and yeah, it's just I'm in a tough spot. I believe there's also some types of checks that lead to checkmate as well, because if you go e7, rook takes d2, king takes, queen g2 check, I think that e7 is not yet a problem. Note that if king d3, there's queen e2 mate. And if king d1, there are also some checks that lead to the capture of the b5 bishop and then actually the protection of the e8 square. So I can't queen. So, but knight takes e6 is a tough move to see, particularly if you're in time trouble, as we both were. Instead, black played bishop f6, and this gave me more time to consolidate because now I played bishop f2, which pretty much stops the f-pawn in its tracks, challenges the queen on g1, and maybe gives me the opportunity to take on c7. So now queen h2 is played, and now I actually went bishop d4 because I thought, oh my gosh, now this bishop is loose on f6, this queen is loose on h2, I might get the opportunity to trade queens, which was my dream from the beginning. If you recall, several moves ago, I said if I trade queens, still keep the pawn on e6, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to probably hold on. And here, I'm actually doing more than holding on. I actually have a serious advantage. And after queen takes d2 check was played, he was actually visibly upset. You could tell that something had gone horribly wrong. King takes d2, knight e4 check, king e3, I'm almost in a position where I can potentially win the game. Because if these bishops come off the board or something clears, I have e7, e8 queen. I need to perhaps control the f pawn, right? Because this pawn is a little bit of a problem. But if I manage to consolidate now, I actually have the better pawn structure, the more active pieces, and I might actually win this game. So I was very, very excited here, and I kind of would realize I'd been defending for a long time and something had changed. So after king e3, f2 was played, threatening to queen, and I have a few ways to win the game here. The easiest way was rook c7, and I did do that. The idea was that with rook takes c7, my bishop is eyeing the f1 square, and additionally, the king can't get into the game, and I'm also threatening the e4 knight, and the bishop on f6, and again, I'm holding that queening square. So far, so good. And now bishop takes d4 is played, and I have a decision here. The decision is, do I want to take the knight or do I want to take the bishop? Again, my bishop is still controlling the f1 square, but I do have to make that decision. I decided to take the bishop, but actually taking the knight might have been easier. And the reason for this is after king takes e4, I'm still guarding this square and hitting the bishop on d4 at the same time. And after bishop takes d4, I can go rook f7 and get behind the pawn where it turns out it doesn't go anywhere. Rook g1 could be played, but again, this pawn is lost. There's no way to preserve this pawn. If you go rook g2, I can just push e7. So, and again, f1 queen doesn't really do anything because I could take it, and even here, my bishop's holding the square. So, no problem there. So, after rook g1, I just could take that pawn, and again, this is a protected passed pawn. So, the rook would have to get behind it. I could block. Black could also stop me from queening for a moment, but I could trade into a winning endgame, a winning rook endgame where I wind up getting two connected passed pawns and can kind of just clean up from there. So that was one way. I decided to go king takes d4, and it does not spoil anything. And I realized here, okay, my bishop is holding the square. I was thinking, you know what, maybe I'm going to push e7. Maybe I'm going to go rook f7 and win this game. And now the knight is even harassed. And here, black played knight f6. And something crazy happened. After knight f6, I went rook f7 to get my rook behind the knight, which I thought was what I wanted to do all along, challenge this knight, get it, then win the f2 pawn, and then bring the e pawn home. And after rook f7, he thought for a while and banged out rook g4 check and offered me a draw. Or actually, that's not how it happened. He played rook g4 check, and then he hit my clock, and then I was thinking for a few minutes. And while I was thinking, he offered a draw. And I must say this shook me up a little bit because I realized that I was winning the game now. I realized that I had to figure out where to go with my king. I have to move my king. But I realized I'm probably winning this game. I just have to make one or two more decent decisions. But offering me a draw while it's my turn is completely unprofessional. It happens from time to time, normally with juniors. And this guy, is an adult. A Grandmaster, a very experienced player, should have known better. But I think what he was doing was kind of bending the rules a little bit and taking advantage of my time situation. He banged out his move rook g4 because he was actually at around 2 minutes. And I was at around 4 minutes for the whole game. And this is a very critical moment. And, I'm trying to figure out, I'm calculating variations, trying to figure out what to do. And him offering the draw on my turn kind of disrupts my thinking for a moment. And in the moment, you just kind of can't really call it out so much. You're just trying to focus. But it did shake me enough to make the worst blunder I think I've made in the history of my chess games. And you're not going to believe this, but I played king d3. And when I played it, and I saw what I had done, even before he made his move, I was in shock. I almost went pale. I realized what I had done. I moved my bishop in the front of the line of... I moved my king in front of the line of the bishop so it can't guard the f1 square anymore. And I pulled back my chair, and I held my hands in my head, and I couldn't believe what I'd done as he had played the move f1 queen. And I sat there for a few minutes and was despondent. I just couldn't believe it. And I extended my hand and resigned. He, of course, signed the score sheets and very quickly walked off. And I was left thinking about what could have been. I was so close to the finish line and, really tripped and fell on my face in a moment when I just need to play a few more normal moves. Just to give you a sense of what those normal moves were, if I play king e3, just chasing the f2 pawn, knight takes d5 does potentially come with check, but it doesn't matter because I can just go king takes f2, and now this pawn can race up the board. Note that if you play a move like rook e4 to try and stop this pawn, that doesn't really solve very much because I have this move bishop c6, and now I'm going to win a piece because you can't actually stop me from taking the knight and playing e7. Also, if black does go f1 queen right away, I could just take this queen, and after knight takes d5, just move my king. And you can see now the rook can't even get to e4. It would have to go back to g7. And here the win is actually still very trivial because not only do I have the e6 pawn, I also potentially have an outside passer on the a file. So it's just gravy. But I don't have to give up the e6 pawn. I can just play rook d7. And you can see the black rook can't take on d7 because if rook takes, e takes, I queen. So the black rook can't capture, and now I just take on d6, and I just take more pawns, and my bishop is just a far superior piece. So, anyways, king d3 is played, and that was all she wrote. And I went from potentially being on 6 out of 7 and playing on board 1 the next day to being on 5 out of 7 and in a totally different position. I must say it was the most heartbreaking game of my career, but there was still tournament left. There were still 2 rounds to go, and it still had been a good event for me, so I could still fight on, and that's what I was going to do. I spoke to many people after the game. Just being such a tough game, I talked to some people back home, tried to lift my spirits in some ways, and, tried to take the energy into the next game. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster, you could do so by checking out the description below. Thanks. Take care.